done to the Transfer Act. We have with us today M. Jeffers Ryer, CCIM, SIOR, and President and CEO of Ryer Associates, Commercial Real Estate, longtime practitioner in commercial real estate, and also Mark J. Duclos, SIOR, CRE, FRICS. We all get these letters, and President of Sentry Commercial. I should point out Mark is also the global president of SIOR. Quite a position. Glad to have Mark from Connecticut in that role. And also, like Jeff and many of you on the call, a longtime commercial real estate practitioner. So the topic, as I started off saying, is the updates, to have a discussion on the updates being made as we speak to the Transfer Act. And as background, this came out of legislative action in the first week of October. It's a bill called HB 7001, and the title is an act revising provisions of the Transfer Act and authorizing the development and implementation of a release-based remediation program. A lot of words, but sounds good. In some of the material that's been distributed, they've actually referred to this as the cessation of the Transfer Act or the replacement of the Transfer Act. And either way, whichever way we look at it, it holds out the prospect of big changes to the Transfer Act. And there's much yet to be done, but there are updates circulating, and both Jeff and Mark have been involved in this issue for the last many months, maybe years. And we've all, of course, if you're in this business, have been subject to some of the rules and regs by the Transfer Act. So let's start off. And my first question for the panelists, Jeff and Mark, is, what's the most important aspect of this legislation as we've seen it so far from the perspective of a commercial real estate practitioner? And I'm going to ask Jeff to give us his thoughts on that question, and then followed by Mark. So Jeff, what's the single most important aspect in your view?
Well, first, you guys, I hope you all can hear me okay. Good? Too bad. Anyway, actually, I'm gonna change it up a bit. There's really there's potentially two most important aspects. The first one is certain, and that's what we achieved in this legislative session, as far as the steps that we took should pull some things out of the Transfer Act, but also should make those properties subject to the Transfer Act change hands, trade more quickly, more cheaply, or hopefully more cheaply and more quickly and more simply. There's some really nice things in there that help reduce the cost of a trade of a Transfer Act property, the investigational. But in the long term, and this is why it's kind of uncertain, this opening to sunset the Transfer Act, to terminate it, is going to be a game changer for us if we do it right. And I only say that because we've made several attempts to change the Transfer Act, and not too many things actually have been done. This upcoming working group that's going to be considering this is going to be very diverse. It's going to have environmental people, LEP. It's a very broad group of people involved in this thing, and so how long it takes and how we get it is going to be really up in the air. But if it does do it and we do it right, this could be a great economic thing for the state, because instead of being the second of one of two states with the Transfer Act, we'll end up with something that might encourage economic development if we're good at it. Great. So sorry for long-windedness.
No, that's great. That's great. We'll come back to the working group discussion in a minute. I'd like to just hear you elaborate a little bit on how that's being set up and so on. Mark, your reaction to this question of, what do you see as the most important thing here that's going to impact us?
Well, I could tell you first and foremost, a little clarity. I can give you an example, and in fact, actually, just this morning we had a meeting for a client in East Hartford, and new client, and we're talking about they bought the property a few years prior, and we asked them, my colleague and I asked them, hey, when you bought it, were you subject to the Transfer Act? And the big question was, what's the Transfer Act? And of course, our response was, well, if you have to ask that question, then you weren't subject to the Transfer Act, because you would know the Transfer Act if you were subject to it. So it brings a little clarity to the process of closing property. I mean, going back to the original working group, which was last year, beginning of last year, which affected the changes for the October changes. Somebody came up with the idea, and it certainly wasn't me, that changed it from a environmental issue to an economic issue. Economic for the state of Connecticut, the loss of revenues purely because of the Transfer Act. So, the confusion of what the Transfer Act is. And, I can give you an example. We had a situation in Northern Connecticut with a out-of-state environmental company who did a report on the property a couple of years ago, and they just happen to mention the Transfer Act in their summary. That this could be a possibility of a Transfer Act. And this was a phase one. They didn't even go into the details. They didn't even ask for a manifest, but boy, did it clear up red flags. And that really became a major issue, and has become a major issue in that. So my client, of course, not familiar with the Transfer Act, turns around and says, but the property's not dirty. And I said, well, no, Rob, it's not about being dirty. What do you mean it's not about being dirty? It's about what, ex-tenant was doing in that building, and did it put you in as an establishment? So just the total lack of clarity. And then, of course, the process that we'll get into about proving a negative, right? And the cost of proving a negative, and the cost in this particular deal just to prove a negative and file the right papers, probably about $70,000 to $80,000 at the least. So clarity to me, if we can get to a release-based system, and obviously there's points that be worried about what you ask for, but the reality, it cannot be worse than the lack of clarity in the Transfer Act and what it means to people and the cost.
So let's talk a little bit about the what the current status is. So Jeff, you referred to the working group. Can you explain to the audience a little bit about what's going on?
Sure. So but a little bit of history on this thing. Back a couple of years ago, Frank Hurd just finally got pissed off at the Transfer Act and said, we've got to do something about it. So he knew I had, so he and I went into CTR, Connecticut Realtors, and met with them. And they, once they learned of what the Transfer Act was, were very supportive. And we also worked with CERC on it. And that's kind of the genesis. That, and we brought in LEPs, we brought in some attorneys that handle the environmental transfers. We brought in some more SIOR commercial brokers, and we had multiple discussions at CERC's office trying to figure out the way. And to Mark's point, prior attempts to make the Transfer Act sane again were based on going through the environmental committee. And Jim Heckman, I think, well, we had some discussion there, and I don't know who ended up winning the day, but we all said, let's go through Commerce instead. And once we talked with Joan Hartley and Carolyn Simmons about it, and they started to understand what the Transfer Act was, they were all on board too. CTR commissioned an economic study on what the Transfer Act is costing Connecticut. That will be, if you don't have a copy, we don't seem to be able to load these things into the chat section. So Gina's going to be sending this to participants in this study, but that's just, it's devastating. And it just really in black and white tells you what's going on. So we had a really broad bill that we wanted to get through, and we pushed it through. And as we were going into it, basically, we got a very, very pared down thing with a pledge to create a working group. So that year we got the 100 kilogram exemption and a couple of other things, a one-time exemption for it. And it set up a working group, which created the working group that we were in last year, which is where we have the bill that we've got right now. So this bill also includes the requirement to create a working group to look into retiring the Transfer Act. This group is a lot broader than the prior ones. Last ones were mainly economic. We didn't even bring the environmental people. There were very few people involved in the last group. This one, they're going to have a big seat at the table. Brokers, Frank and I are part of this thing. There's a lot of LEPs, a lot of attorneys in it, and of course, Commerce and environmental committees. So It's very broad based, but that makes it really hard to get a consensus. But I think the brilliance of how we're going through this with economic impacts to Connecticut may unify people, because it's broadly recognized that the Transfer Act has stunted our ability to develop over the past 20, 40 years now. It's 83 or 86, something like that. So it's a very broad base. Our first meeting is in December 8th or something like that. So Zoom, obviously, and it'll be an interesting thing to experience, to say the least.
So that's next week.
Yeah.
And what do you see this group doing next? Is it from the reading I've done, it looks like the next step is to come up with a lot of what's in that original bill, sort of responsive to that, new regulations and new reporting requirements and new verification requirements. Is that what the working group is focused on? Yeah,
and it's really, I mean, the mandate we had for this last sessions was very defined. This thing for sunsetting the Transfer Act, there's a lot of, and I think you might have sent the Pullman note on the different requirements that we need to consider. It's really going to be very broad. We're basically writing a whole new thing, and we have to do it in a way that protects the environment, makes transaction costs low, and is seen as economically forward for the state. We get some good PR out of it too.
That's good. Mark, comments on what you'd like to see out of the working group's work going forward?
Sunset the Transfer Act. Get it done with.
Well,
I don't care what it looks like. Just
Mark,
get it
as
done.
they say, be careful for what you ask for.
I know. Listen, I could tell you, we've been dealing with this since in the mid 1980s. It is something that has been a very difficult thing to deal with our clients. I could tell you that it's the first time in my essentially my career that we have some optimism that this thing will be sunset. And I can tell you the prevailing attitude is certainly, please, to my attitude, just sunset the damn thing. And I get that we could have some difficulty in this working group, and that there might not be the bill that we're looking for when it's all said and done, but it cannot possibly be a more difficult bill than what we've got with the Transfer Act, at least in my opinion. Again, it's costly. I will say that it is causing that the working group, or with the place that we're at with this whole issue, is causing a lot of questions with clients as to, listen, should we hold on to the property? Should we wait? Things like that. So there is a pause. That is a negative, because there is a pause saying, maybe I should wait, or should I go? And I can tell you right now, it's probably generally wait till you see these things start playing out. So it could have a temporary negative effect, but the overall long terms, I cannot imagine it's not a positive.
Yeah, we're hearing the same thing about a pause. Should we wait? So what, Jeff, back to you for a minute. What do you see the schedule for this working group? When will they have rules and regs? And I guess that's question number one. And question number two is, what has to happen if I know you mentioned that reaching consensus is going to be hard, but let's assume that they reach consensus by April or May. Is no further legislative action is required? It's just departmental approval. Is that how it happens?
No, I think it'll have to be legislated down the line, but there's a long path. And one of the things to the folks who say, should we wait or should we go, kind of a thing, it really is up in the air. I wouldn't doubt. I mean, some people are saying a year or so, but it would surprise me if it was not 2 years out or longer to get this done. I mean, different groups will have to have unified standards of cleanup. We're going to have contamination levels determined. We're going to have all the reporting, all the fines set out. It's a really big task. And like I said, the environmental people are going to go in there on one side and the developers on another side. And it's just, it's going to take a lot to do. And frankly, we're all, hopefully we'll be able to do this without rancor and with the spirit of, coming together and create something that we can get rid of the Transfer Act for.
Yeah, you hope everybody can rally around the idea that doing something good here is going to help the economic development situation in the state of Connecticut.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, one of the things on that, to your point, Mike, when the original group started, geez, I'm dating myself, but I think it was the beginning of last year. Time has kind of run into each other lately, but and we decided that this was going to be presented to the Commerce Committee. The effort originally was to go and try to quantify what the economic damage was of the act, and so it really went out to the brokerage community. I think substantially, right, Jeff? To
Oh, yeah.
get, yeah. So substantially, there was a call to arms with the brokerage community, and to try to quantify the amount of transactions that actually fell by the wayside because of the act. The number was staggering, and the number didn't even represent anywhere near what the actual number was. And I think it's safe to say when it went to local statesmen or local politicians, whoever it may be, leaders, they looked at some of the lists and said, oh my goodness, I didn't even know that was even going to happen. Never mind, I didn't even know it was even there. So huge numbers.
You see a crappy building in the middle of a central business district, you just drive by it, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, whether someone's tried to buy it or whether the sellers have just said, we don't have the funds to even think about remediating or investigating what the problems are with this building. And they sit there.
And one of the biggest things I found, Jeff, is, and we've talked about this before, it really, what really, I don't want to say disturbs me, but really challenges me is the poster child for the Transfer Act is usually they're going to show a picture of a 10-story dilapidated mill. All right. And you're going to say, well, this is the poster child for the problems of the Transfer Act. You can't rehab these things. And yes, that's a problem. You can't rehab. But you know what? You equally could have a 200,000 square foot high bay tilt up building, beautiful, pristine, that can't transfer either because of the Transfer Act.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
It's the Transfer Act's focus on use rather than actual contamination is just, it's just, a nightmare.
Yeah. For the audience, there is an ability to submit questions. I've got the chat window open. If you put any of your questions in there, I'll be happy to pose them to our panelists. But let's keep moving here. So timing wise, Jeff, it sounds like this is not likely to hit the legislative session until what, the spring of 22, I would guess? Next year?
Yeah, I mean, COVID, the Zoom stuff is just so hard to be productive on. Yeah. And the interactions that are necessary, it's going to be really, really tough for things. Right. And of course, they're going to break into small subgroups that'll take care of contaminant levels, and the LEPs will probably do that. And some of the penalty, so the attorneys and the LEPs and we'll all, break into groups to take this thing one bite at a time. But it really does. I mean, working in that group, I'm not a legal guy. And I see a lot of the Transfer Act and all the legal terms and the stuff, and my eyes glaze over. So I know what practically it does for us, but the minutia that they go through to get it to do what it's supposed to do, all the parts that make up that engine are just incredible, and I gotta just fully admire how they handled it.
So Frank Amodio, Frank Amodio asked the question of whether there are models in other states that Connecticut can look at. Do other states have a legislative environment that's a good analog for Connecticut to adopt, that we could accelerate this? Obviously 22 is an election year. So one would have to be concerned that people are going to be looking at the calendar and saying, gee, anything I vote on in April or May of 22 could come back to cause me grief in the election season coming up. But are there legislative analogs that we can look to in other states that we think are good ideas?
I'm gonna take the ball and then I'm gonna kick it right over to Jeff, because this is one thing that's always confounded me, and a lot of it's because of my style, which is, oh boy, if somebody wrote the book already, why do I want to create a new book? Why don't I just steal their book?
I'm with you on that.
That's really what the question is. And I'm always like, well, we got this state to the north of us where I do transactions in Massachusetts all the time. And quite frankly, I have never lost a transaction because of environmental in the state of Massachusetts ever in 34 years. So I look at that release-based program. I go, well, why don't you just ask them for the book and copy it and stamp Connecticut on it and say, we're good to
Yeah.
go. I'm going to kick the ball to you, Jeff. What's wrong with that theory? Because there's a problem with that theory. I know.
There's always a problem with that theory. For any theory. No. Well, first of all, the Massachusetts model is what we generally refer to when we talk about a replacement. Like, why don't we go to the Massachusetts-based model? And that's, certainly there's aspects of it, but one thing that is in there is Massachusetts has a much different backbone, people-wise, LEP-wise, and stuff that Connecticut doesn't have. So it may take some structural personnel changes and how we handle things for that to work. I'm really not all that sure about it. I haven't done any business up in Massachusetts, but my understanding is like their LEP industry, it's much broader and they've got huge powers compared to what our guys are able to do. So, that's what is used to talk about it. And I'm an absolute fan. I would take all 50 states and find it, just pour through them all and have, a group of people cherry pick the best aspects and which ones would fit, Connecticut style and all, and come up with something.
But
and there's a bit of a history on that. The Connecticut legislature, when they adopted the current tax increment financing legislation in 2015, that's essentially what they did, was they adopted Maine's legislation because it was the most recent and most updated. Sorry, I interrupted you, Mark. You were about.
Oh, no. I think so. It sounds to me that it's safe to say it's really the infrastructure challenges, maybe with the state of Connecticut and such, that may be different from Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I don't I haven't done anything in Mass, and we didn't have any in-depth stuff. But when I'm talking with the group, they're saying, be careful, because if you adopted Massachusetts without making some structural changes, the stress to our system would be it could collapse the system or something. So,
and one of the challenges is we're understaffed as a state, period. Correct. Right. That's a major challenge, is that we are understaffed at the DEP.
Right.
Yeah, we see that in different departments across the state. Another question that we've got is, if you're an existing certifying party and you're working on the transfer of a property, but you're only partway through that process, what's your advice to someone who's currently in the process but hasn't completed it? Doesn't sound like you think they should wait.
Well, it depends on how much you need the money. Because you hold off. I mean, who knows what the economic conditions are going to be down there and all. And the release-based system is basically not going to stop you from having first of all, if you transfer a property now and you're subject to the Transfer Act, you're not getting out of it. I mean, you have to work your way out. It's not like, suddenly everybody in the Transfer Act goes on parole. They have to work their way through it. So if you do sell a property that's subject to the Transfer Act, you're in it. But if you hold off and don't, you find a buyer, they're still going to do a phase one. It's going to lead to a phase two. It's going to lead to requirements to remediate. And here's the thing: when the requirement to remediate is going to be for any spill that happens that they know about, but also past spills that you know about, that you find out. So where the Transfer Act, so that means if a guy does a phase one and finds places to remediate in many places, then he's going to have to address it. It's not taking away our obligation to clean properties. It does take away the transactional cost and time that it takes to get a property out of the Transfer Act.
Right. So overall, the goal is to improve the process.
And the other thing it does is, right now, properties that are in the Transfer Act are vastly more expensive to research and to quantify the issues and to remediate than are properties that aren't subject to the Transfer Act. Right. The idea within this will be that all properties will be created and treated equally. So, okay, you've got a chemical spill, clean it up to XYZ standards, which are the same all the way across the state, regardless, depending on contamination levels. So, that'll be good. But again, you've got to offset. You just don't know when this is going to pass and what it's going to look
Yeah.
like when it does.
Right, right. So a couple of questions that we've got in the chat window about the response from the LEP group. Are they generally concerned about the reduction in their, or do they perceive this as something as a negative to their business and are going to oppose it? Or how do you see that playing out? And keep in mind, this is being recorded.
I was going to say that's got a hint of cynicism to it.
Me?
No. The question, you're just reporting. Just report the facts, sir.
Yeah.
I think the general feeling is that frankly, that the answer would be yes, that there might be, but I can't really say that for a fact. I don't know if you're hearing anything else yourself, Jeff.
I've heard people talk about it, but I haven't said any of the people that I've talked to, the LEPs that I've talked to have not said, they're expressed that they're vehemently opposed to it. I don't, just to a large degree, I would say a lot of the folks that we work with, they don't like the system that's in place any better than we do. It's a cumbersome, expensive, frustrating system.
Yeah.
Jeff?
And they don't like being beat up by their clients when they find out that it's going to
Right.
cost them $100,000 to do something that otherwise would have cost them 15 or 20. So no, they're not happy with that. And then the clients are always, berating them for creating the problem, and it's not their problem. They're just, So no, the only LEPs that I've worked with in conjunction with this thing are quite happy with it and thinking that, there may be some business lost, but then there's also going to be business gained.
Yeah, the prospect of more activity.
Yeah.
And it does go to the point a little bit that one of the things about the Transfer Act that always amazes me is you could get your work done. You do all the investigation, you get the reports, and now you've got one side saying it's subject to the Transfer Act and the other side saying it's not subject to the Transfer Act. And then we get lawyers involved to give legal opinions. And so to me, if you've got something like a Transfer Act, it should be pretty definable. Yes, it's subject to it or it's not. We have had a number of situations just in the last, I'm going to say the last year, but it could even be just the last 8 months, where we've had to get lawyers' opinions in the files so that we, come up with a decision. So it's not that clear cut. Yes, it's subject to it or not. And I think that's part of probably where the LEPs get a little bit of bad hit too, because they, as Jeff said, and as you said, Mike, you've got to do the investigation and you have to do what you got to do. But the final result, some people will look at and go, so what do we learn? And on the Transfer Act, sometimes it's like, I'm not sure. We got a little difference of opinion here. Well, we just did 12 studies and we still have a difference of opinion.
Yeah. We've had a couple of those
frustrating part. Jeff, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on the difference between the current system and this, what's been referred to as moving to a release-based system. A few people have asked me exactly what does that mean?
Okay, so with the Transfer Act, there are certain classifications of what you do that puts you into the Transfer Act, creates an establishment, whether or not you've been a bad boy. So even if all of your, so you ship a large quantity of chemicals and waste in and out of your place, you'd be subject to the Transfer Act. But if you've got all of your manifests and everything is in order and every drop of that stuff is accounted for, you're still in the Transfer Act. And that means they go out there and they do all the testing that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily need to do. And you've got to file a form. And, you have to basically, as Mark was saying in the introduction, you have to prove a negative. And it gets very slow and very expensive to do that. Transferring an industrial property subject to the Transfer Act is going to require a more extensive environmental review than it would if it was not in there. Now, if there happened to have been a spill on the property, say you had a UST that leaked, or say you had a small, 50-gallon drum of something spilled or what have you, the requirement would be is when it happens, you got to clean it up. And this is under the spill-based type thing, and you have to clean it up to the standards that will be plainly stated within the law, hopefully. Then if during your investigations, you find something else that happened, so you do an environmental and they say, okay, there was an underground storage tank over here. We've got to find it. We got to check it. Oh, there's some stuff that we've got to deal with. That's a spill. It's not hazardous. Oil's not hazardous, but you've got to clean it up. So that's probably what you'd have to do under any normal environmental due diligence, a buyer isn't going to want to buy the problems that a seller has, right? At the beginning, it's not their problem. They don't need to acquire it. So they're going to make sure that the stuff quantify what they can do for the most part. So that's the biggest thing. There's shielding of liability. So if you didn't actually create the problem and you found it and you've got to clean it up, you don't have liabilities from it. At least that's what the provisions are, what they want us to include in this this plan. So, so I think what will happen is, instead of waiting for a property necessarily to transfer when these things happen, some of the stuff could be done beforehand. We'll have to see. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns on it.
Well, arguably, Jeff, the release base, is it fair to say that the release based system really is more in line with what we want in environmental anyway? If you have a release, clean it, not wait until the transfer of the property. Clean it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and that's better for and it'll get cleaned. We won't have properties that are just sitting there with nothing happening to them because of the onerous cost, the additional costs of the complying with the Transfer Act.
That's right.
So,
another question I've heard people ask is, they've read some of the overviews that have been circulating, and in some of those overviews, it refers to the possibility of certain exemptions that would be provided if the issue can be remediated by containment or removal or mitigation. Do you see that those exemptions likely to survive this process, the working group process, and later get legislative approval?
Well, I hope they do. I mean, you already have the ability to encapsulate. You already can put a deed restriction on your properties to prevent, say, residential development over contamination. So those sort of things. I mean, Frank, there's going to be a strong influence on economics with this. Lehman has been very involved in this thing and is going to be watching this thing. So long as we keep that in mind, we need to do it where, okay, it solves the environmental problem, the risks to people. Say it's going to be oil that's going to turn back to the dinosaurs in decades anyway. So put a parking lot over it or something. Let's be smart about our environmental regulations, become a model that the U.S. could look at rather than be the donkey that the U.S. states look at.
I would just say that just strongly, we need those exemptions, right? I mean, if you can't encapsulate, you can't do an EU environmental land use restriction. I always get the letters wrong, ELUR. Those kind of things would be, that'd be a problem. That'd be a problem with economic development, because those are way, especially in farmed areas and certain areas that of the state that will invite those kind of things. To put a land use restriction, we're good. We need common. That could be a residential property anyway.
So what would the exemptions cover then? What would they actually be exempting that they're not doing currently? How would that change from current law?
So say you've got some contamination, you can just say the ground conditions are not safe enough for residential use, but you can put up an industrial or manufacturing building here and it'll be perfectly fine. Whereas if you didn't have that land use restriction, you would have to remediate it to residential quality before you put that industrial building up.
Dollars, more and more dollars.
Yeah, right. And time.
Significant.
Yeah, exactly.
So those are very helpful.
So as an industry, this is an industry association, and we have a number of associations in real estate here in Connecticut. What can commercial real estate practitioners do to help this process along? Is it, write letters? Is it contacting their legislator? What do you guys need? You guys have been doing terrific work here on this, and you've got a lot ahead of you still. I think there's a lot of people that are in the industry that would like to do what they can to help. What can they do?
Jeff, you want to tackle that first, because you're on the group?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. First, stay engaged. If legislators, keep them involved as far as, or keep them informed on what's going on. Write letters. When there's a call for a public hearing, if there's something that a person can add to that public hearing, then do it. If you can't actually go there, which is, by the way, public hearing, attending and testifying at a public hearing is incredibly effective. Absolutely, just I cannot. Derek Izowski and I testified under the first time around, and we were the only two testifying for our thing, and it just, I think it helped bring the whole thing around to the commerce and environmental people. So do that. Push with our associations as well. We're a member of JHAR, of Fairfield County Association of Realtors, of Connecticut Association of Realtors, and NAR. CTR jumped on this thing like crazy, and they funded that CERC, the CERC study. And what is it, 17,000 members in the state? You know, and they've shown time and again that is a very powerful block, a good force for whatever evil things that the CTR wants to do. They can motivate us all to do stuff. So stay involved in that. If you're not a member of CTR, if you're not a realtor, consider it, because they really put a lot. They're the ones that are helping us get this stuff done. And as an association, they put the muscle behind it. But yeah, stay involved in it, listen in and see what's going on. If we put out a thing saying, please provide stories of things that have happened to you, let's do it, you know?
Yeah, the real life examples. This is an example of something that I had to deal with. Those are great. I think they're really powerful.
And I know it doesn't make you money, and it takes maybe 40 minutes to an hour and a half to write something down, and maybe you got to research closing docs and listing docs to make the thing accurate and authentic. But you know, it's think of it as a long-term investment. If it, you know, we've been hampered by this law for, you know, way too long. So let's work on making investment, but both for us and for the people who come after us.
Yeah.
I would just piggyback that a little bit. One thing I've learned through this process, because I was never a big call to action guy, I got brought into this group early last year, and with a little bit of cynicism, and I watched the process work. Cynicism is probably a light term for it, but I've seen the system work, and what I've also seen at the national level, being the position at SILR, in my work with NAR, these call for actions are effective. And I think if you get a call for action, I think one of the things is we're also a splintered commercials. Practitioners are a little bit splintered, right? But if you getting that call to action sometimes is a little difficult. But if you do get the call for action, answer it. It's not that hard to do. Put a call into your legislator. Put the email in. Sometimes you get that text. Just text it back and do the call for action. It literally takes a couple minutes to do, but it's effective.
Yeah. And we'll be sure to circulate to the associations what's going on as well. So you'll be updated as things happen and as we need help.
That's great. I would mention to the audience that most of us are members of multiple organizations. So don't limit it to just realtors, or people directly involved in transactional work. If you're a member of AIA or ICSC or CEDAS or REFA or many of the organizations, the planners associations, we're all in this kind of together on these issues, and we've all had to deal with the problems of the Transfer Act for decades. And I think if we can get all these associations to energize their membership to as Mark points out, sort of issue a call to action, we can get a lot of associations and many of their members lined up to help keep pushing this forward. Dan Rosso asked a question, which I think is very good, or makes an observation maybe, which is very good. We see it all the time in the work we do, that, there's a lot of concern out there of the impact of COVID on the value of commercial real estate and the decline in that value and its impact on commercial property tax revenue for towns, for municipalities. And what that and, for every crisis, there's an opportunity. I think the opportunity here is when you talk to legislators and when you talk to town officials, municipal officials, and you start talking about economic development, you get a different response today than you would have 5 or 6 years ago. There's a much greater concern, particularly if you're talking to a town that has a lot of large scale retail and or hotels in it. The value of those two assets in those two sectors is in question, substantially in question going forward. And the revals are starting to scare people a little bit. So the time is good. I think the time is good to make a really strong case to do things which will improve the economic prospects for the state of Connecticut. And hopefully we can get lots of people lined up to help with this one issue and do the things that you guys have recommended in terms of the call to action and writing letters and testifying and so on. So hopefully if the audience takes nothing away from this session, it'll be that, there's a lot of work yet to be done, a lot of time to go by as well as the work continues, and everybody needs to stay engaged and help where they can. So questions, final questions? I'm just following the chat here. A question about sunsetting. It's not really a question. It's just can we talk about the sunsetting idea? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much, unfortunately, the stuff that's in the act, if it's already an establishment, is going to stay there. And Gina's going to be sending out a few documents that I pulled out. One is the CIRC study, economics impact study, if you hadn't read it. Another is the actual act itself. And then the third thing is, and it is ungodly long, it's a list of all of the properties that are considered establishments subject to the Transfer Act. And it's it's an interesting read. It's broken out by town, and it shows you whether it's been disposed of or not. And the columns about disposition dates are distressingly empty. So as far as that goes, it's just, the stuff that's in there, you're stuck with it. They are speeding up, both by law now. They've got less time to say they're going to audit or to audit an LEP's final report, but also they've made some internal, Katie Dykes has made some internal commitments to streamline the department. I think already you see some of this environmental stuff is now going up on the internet, which they didn't have before. The spreadsheet that I'm sending out to you, literally, when I asked for it originally, was an Excel spreadsheet. It was not a database. It was not some kind of a system that had it. It was just a spreadsheet with one line per property. So that's just how unsophisticated they are with this thing. So when I don't know how when the release base comes in, whether it's going to be a switch where, okay, anything that hasn't gotten into the Transfer Act is no, we don't have to worry about it, and it becomes release based, or what. I suspect that's what's going to happen. I don't think they want more. They don't want to have like a I don't know, a wearing in period or anything like that. So
yeah, right.
I think practically, Mark, don't you think that's the? I mean, you have to keep certainty in the market, right?
Totally, totally agree. Yep, 100%. And I think I just reading that question with Dan, it was interesting. Do you think it's going to accelerate this act? I mean, is the point that you brought, Mike, and that Dan brought, which is the decreased revenues in the towns. Do you think, Jeff, they'll accelerate this process, or that's like moving?
I don't think it'll accelerate it. What I think it's going to do, what it might do, is bend it more toward economic advantages versus environmental and all that, which is maybe not so good, but we'll have to see. There'll be a balance, but where if you're a fat and happy state, you might have the luxury of saying save the frogs kind of a thing. This is, if you need the revenue, then maybe your continuum goes a little bit over to the economic development side.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, because I was trying to think what that answer would be, and you're right. If you have anybody in that room that is thinking that this is more of an environmental issue than it is a economic, then maybe they are going to slide a little over to the economic side. And so maybe those difficult discussions maybe become less difficult. And if that's the case, then maybe that does accelerate that process. No promises, but it's a possibility.
I think it's a strong
I'm not sure on the
possibility.
acceleration, that is because there's just so many steps to go on this thing and you want it to be really well thought out. But what I think could happen is that the bill could turn more toward an economic bill than it would have otherwise. So,
Yeah.
We'd have maybe one that's more favorable to development, for example.
Yeah, I think, look, the reality is the state of the economy has sort of risen to the top of the heap of issues that everybody's concerned about. And I don't see that changing. So anything that is perceived as being either in the way or which can be done and would help the economy recover, I think it's going to get carried up as well with that rising interest in economic issues. There is a question about whether we know if New Jersey is working on any modifications to their Transfer Act. So are you guys experts on New Jersey too?
We only use them to say that we're the only two states that have one and that theirs is much better administered. But I don't know what's going on with that.
I don't either. I don't either. I got a lot of New Jersey buddies, but they don't talk about that. I will say, I remember my opening statement when we got this, we participated in this group was, now let me get this right. We got 48 states that have release-based programs. We have 2 that are Transfer Act states. What am I missing?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in Texas, and I would say if you're looking for an analog, you might want to look at Texas regs. At least when I was working there.
Do they have any remediation requirements?
Well, it depends.
It's called a river.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a state that likes gas stations with 160 gas pumps, So,
Amazing.
Jeez.
all right. Well, this has all been very enlightening, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time late in the day to share your thoughts with the audience. To our audience, please watch your email as the GHAR Commercial Alliance continues to work on some topics for future sessions. Feel free to contact us either through Gina or through me. My email is mgoman@gomanyork.com. If you have any topics, if you have any ideas for things that you'd like to hear more about, please feel free to send them along and we'll get the committee to look at them. But we're hoping to do these approximately once a month. And like I said, watch your email and we'll have hopefully some topics that'll be of interest to you. Mark.
Mike, can I bring up one point? Just
Yeah.
one quick point before you sign off. So just, and I'm sure Jeff will be okay with this as well. Listen, we're obviously involved in this. Jeff's more involved in this. We've got other resources that are out there. So if anybody here needs to access those resources, I saw somebody looking for legal, help and those kind of things. We're absolutely there to help out. So feel free to reach out, give us a call, give us an email, and we'll try to get you led in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great, guys. That's the wonderful thing about this industry is you can get a group of people together to share ideas and knowledge like this, and everybody benefits from it. So thanks very much for your time. Let me also thank Gina Michelada and all the wonderful staff at GHAR in Hartford. And to the audience, thanks for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Have a great, safe holiday too, guys.